All right, here, hour number 2 on a Friday. Chris Brown, Steve Tasker with you. Pleased to be joined by Pro Football Focus NFL lead analyst Sam Monson, who joins us on the show. And, we're diving headlong into the offseason with the Super Bowl in the rearview mirror. We started a few weeks earlier than that, Sam. But, looking at the free agent picture out there, I realize the Combine comes first on the calendar, but free agency is where they're going to be able to change the roster primarily. And the Bills have some cap compliancy work to do, being as far over the cap as they are. There seems to be a reasonable path to doing that. But I don't foresee them being active in the market early. I kind of see them taking part in Wave 2, maybe even as late as Wave 3, when the cost of doing business comes down precipitously. What do you anticipate the Bills being in terms of buyers in the free agent market as you see it?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think they'll be shopping in the second or third wave of free agency, which, to be honest, I think is the right way of doing it anyway. Generally, I think the best bargains in free agency tend to happen in those second or third wave, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to wait until all of these players are taken and then see who's left and kind of go through another round of auctioneering. You can get that business done on day one. It's just you have to know that right away you're shopping in a different price bracket than some of the other teams with money to spend who are going after the biggest name. So I think there are going to be players out there that Buffalo will be interested in and maybe even signing or talking to right away. It's just they're not going to be in that first obvious wave of free agency. I think the defensive interior is a really intriguing position this year in terms of free agents. There's some big name guys out there, assuming they hit the market. Chris Jones, Justin Madubuike, maybe neither of those guys are going to actually become free agents. They might get tagged or locked up before that. But there's some guys lower down on that list that I think Buffalo would definitely be interested in talking to and maybe bringing in for an area that's sort of losing talent at the moment in terms of what they've got hitting the market.
One of the things we've talked about at length over the Brandon Beane tenure here in Buffalo, and something that has become a trend around the league, are one-year deals. Buffalo had a ton of those guys on their roster this year signing one-year deals. You see other teams beginning to do that in free agency, particularly with, like you said, where the Bills shop in that second wave of free agency. These guys feel like if they come to Buffalo, put together a good season for a playoff caliber team, they could get one more shot at another team in free agency. And plus, it keeps, even though the money's not guaranteed, it kind of is, because they're signing these guys to play. So it seems like a really good strategy. Do you see that widening in its scope around the league?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of a trend towards kind of prove-it deals in the NFL. I think for the first time in a while, both sides are starting to like what that brings to the table. The players are looking for that 1 year because the big contract they're looking for isn't there now. So rather than take a lower market deal, they're betting on themselves on a 1 year increment and trying to cash in next year. And then I think the teams are liking the value that those players can bring to the table, motivated, trying to bet on themselves, trying to make one really good year to then go and get paid somewhere else. So I think it's a nice concept that works for a lot of player and team combinations. And a team like Buffalo can sell players on, come and try and win a championship as well. I know they haven't done it yet, but they're going to be contenders. Josh Allen, with the talent that is there on that Buffalo team, they can sell teams on, or sell players on, come have a good year for us. You'll be playing for a championship caliber team. You have a shot at winning a ring as well. There's a lot of good points to that. You're not going to lose value by having a good year here.
I want to flesh out, that defensive tackle conversation that you touched on a little bit earlier there, Sam, because yes, it's a market that will be flush with defensive tackle talent. I just wonder how deep Buffalo can dip their toe there. It is an expensive position. I think there is value in the market, but we know that they do want to bring Daquan Jones back, and I think we all understand why. He's a little longer in the tooth. Do you have any players in mind that are somewhere in the 26 to 29-year-old range who could fit in what is anticipated to be a pretty strict free agent budget for Buffalo?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're shopping in that second and third wave, you're talking about players where there's some concern. There's a red flag somewhere, right? So you're not talking about these perfect prospects, but there's a couple of guys I think that I would certainly be interested in talking to if I'm Buffalo. One is Javon Kinlaw from the 49ers, a former first round pick, was expected to be an incredible pass rusher in the NFL. Years worth of injuries, just really slow start to his career. Didn't really happen until this year, where he's had a really good season just before free agency. I'd be really curious to know what the market for him is like. Now, maybe it's going to be much hotter than the Bills can stand because he's got that former first round pedigree, and we finally got to see what he could do with a healthy season, albeit one with Javon Hargrave and Nick Bosa and, all the talent that the 49ers have around him. But if teams are scared away by his injury history, he would certainly be one to talk to. And then Tier Tart, the guy that used to play for the Tennessee Titans, there's some sort of character concerns, some attitude issues with him, but he's been a very good disruptive player for the Titans when he was on the field before they fell out with him. Again, a guy that I would be intrigued to talk to figure out if there's a natural mesh there, and if there is, someone that could absolutely present value given the sort of red flags I think that will be out there for other teams.
And obviously also the Bills and their number 2 wide receiver free agency draft. We always tend to think, it's going to be a great draft. We're going to see if we can get one. But basically most of these teams, and the Bills have really done this in past years, they fill all these holes with free agency so that they can get to the point where it doesn't have to be a need when the player comes up on the draft board. They can draft the best player who's going to be the best pro no matter what position he makes. What do you think about that philosophy, and where does that leave the Bills with a number 2 wide out in a wide receiver deep draft?
Yeah, I mean, generally, philosophically, I think that's a smart way of doing business. You shouldn't go into the draft with needs to fill. You want to fill your needs. You want to get players that you're comfortable starting, even if they're not necessarily the best players in the world. Just a guy can go out there and do a job, worst case scenario, so that you don't have to chase players in the draft. That being said, I think it is an incredible wide receiver draft. And whether you're going to draft one in the first round, the second round, or even later in the draft, I think you can get guys this year that can come in, be impact contributors right away, make an immediate impact. We saw last year the Texans drafted Tank Dell in the 3rd round. He's one of the better wide receivers in that draft class right out of the gate. I think you're going to be able to get players that can make that kind of impact deep into this draft. So I think absolutely they can dip their toe in free agency, bring in, 1 or 2 low price wide receivers that they can fill out the depth chart. But I think absolutely they're going to be targeting receiver in this draft as well. And I'd be very surprised if they didn't come away with one in those first few rounds.
Yeah, and it may have to come in round 1 if the board falls right, because I think the general consensus is the Bills don't just need an outside presence in their receiving core, but they need someone capable of taking over the number 1 receiving role maybe as soon as the second half of next year, certainly by 2025. So you need someone with pedigree and an ability to step into a giant role pretty early in their career. That usually needs to happen at the top of the draft, and the problem is the Bills are picking 28th. And they're not the only team looking for an alpha male at wide receiver. I know it's early, and, how are we going to predict what's going to be available at 28? The Bills missed the receiver run last year, got one of the best pass-catching tight ends in the draft. Brandon Beane pivoted well. Do you think it's deep enough to perhaps still find a guy who at least down the line could be a number 1 as low as 28?
No, I really do, actually. I think so. One of the differences between this year's wide receiver group and last year's, once you got beyond the first couple of picks, and even actually the first couple of guys like Jordan Addison, so many of the wide receivers were small, and they were sort of questions whether they could be number 1 guys or whether they could just come in and be really useful parts of a receiving core. But there was a real lack of those kind of big bodied X type receivers, those prototypical number 1 size players for the first couple of rounds. And then they started to come back later in the draft. This year, I think there's a ton of those guys. I actually think that's a strength of this draft. And maybe they're not as good across the board as they were a year ago, but there's a lot of guys that you would say, okay, right now, maybe that guy is not a number 1, but maybe next year he could step in with a year of development in the NFL and he could be a true number one guy. I'm thinking of guys like A.D. Mitchell from Texas. Keon Coleman from Florida State is going to be a polarizing one that is going to divide a lot of people, but I think he has that kind of potential. Troy Franklin from Oregon. These are all guys that have, I think, that kind of potential, maybe not year one, but year two.
Why is Keon Coleman so polarizing for people out of Florida State?
He's got a lot of sort of troubling metrics, troubling production numbers. It's very difficult to construct a statistical case that he's going to be an elite top-end receiver. But you watch the tape. I actually think he was much better this year than he was a year ago at Michigan State, even though the numbers would say the reverse. I think there's a lot of evidence of him developing as a route runner this year. I think you can see a lot more nuance to his game. If you watch him return punts, I think you see him move an awful lot better than he did catching some of these kind of screens that went nowhere for Florida State. So there's a lot of potential there. Some of his highlight plays are absolutely mind-blowing and spectacular. But people are going to get bogged down in the numbers. They're going to get bogged down in the lack of production relative to a lot of these other guys. And I think he'll have a lot of people sort of against him because he doesn't tick a lot of these boxes. He will be an outlier if he succeeds because most receivers, they do come with that kind of college production.
Right. And if we're just going to take a sample of what Buffalo was valuing in terms of pass catchers last year, and, Kincaid is an example of this, they were focused on separation ability and catch rate because that was an issue. I mean, this team was second in the league in drop passes in 2022. They just wanted to find guys with high catch rates and who could separate to be early, easy button answers for Josh in the passing game. Does Coleman fit that bill, or is he too much of an enigma to put in that box?
Yeah, so it's inconsistency. I mean, he has some plays where his ability to catch the ball is absolutely insane. Like he jumps up over a guy, one hands a post route over the middle in a way that there might be two guys in this draft class who are able to do that. But he'll also drop a couple of easy ones as well. He's got some plays where he does show really nice ability to separate, particularly late in the play, just a quick bounce in one direction to get into a hole and to settle into a gap and give the quarterback a window. But he doesn't separate in man coverage consistently the way some of these other receivers do. So I think if you're drafting Keon Coleman, you're doing it with the idea that he is a bit of a project, and you're going to try and sort of teach him the real nuances of how to get that consistency to his game. And if he can do that, then I think he can become special. But I think there are a lot of teams that will be scared away by that and will instead kind of look to a safer option in this draft.
How many guys, wide receivers we're talking about, will go in the first round? Do you think it'll be like, and I'm not saying a specific number, but is it like at least 4 and maybe as many as 8, something like that? Well, how many are you thinking are absolutely going to be gone after the first round?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be 5 or 6, something like that. I think it's a strong group of wide receivers. The top 3 are better than they were a year ago. Last season we were debating between Jordan Addison, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Quentin Johnston. This year, Marvin Harrison Jr., I mean, he might be the best prospect to come along in a decade out of Ohio State. Malik Neighbors, Rome Odunze, those are the top 3 guys, I think, on almost every single board. All of those guys, I think you would see as consistently all of them would be number 1 a year ago. So I think those 3 are probably in the top half of the first round, maybe even the top 10. And then it's a case of, Brian Thomas, Keon Coleman, A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, maybe Troy Franklin. There's going to be a bunch more of these guys. I think you'll get 2, maybe 3 more of them in the first round.
And is there anybody that comes to mind there with some of that criteria that I mentioned, like a high catch rate guy who's a consistent separator? Who would fall into that bucket if you had to pick 1 or 2?
A name that is sneaking into some first rounds is Ladd McConkey, the Georgia wide receiver. That guy's got incredible acceleration. His blaze outs, those kind of routes that Julio Jones always used to run, you sort of fake inside and then break right out towards the sideline and just leave the DB flying into the middle of the field. He runs those as well as anybody I can remember seeing since Julio Jones. He's got great hands. He's a guy I think that would absolutely tick those boxes and could easily slip into the first round at this point.
Good stuff. Good
Sam,
stuff.
Thanks for the
Sam,
time
thanks
as always.
so much.
Hope you feel better over the weekend here, and we'll catch up with you down the line this offseason. Thanks.